guys, it's Reagan and welcome back to another video. Today I am here with another seasonal recommendation. In my mind and in my heart, it is springtime. In Texas anyway, we've officially ventured into the 70-degree days. I have a new spring dress on, which I'm a big fan of, which can only mean one thing: some spring book recommendations. That's right, I have a collection of books to chat through today. All of them I would say are kind of lyrical and beautiful, and many of them also have a sort of growth or rebirth component, or like they're as beautiful as like a fresh garden, if you will. That was kind of the direction I was going for this video. Without further ado, let's just go ahead and dive right in. The first book I'm going to chat about is a recent favorite, and that is The Inheritance of Arcadia Divina by Zoraida Cordova. This is for sure one of my favorite multi-generational family-centered stories that also has a dash of magic at the heart of it. It's also lyrical and beautiful and spans kind of two different time periods, kind of bridging together one family through space and time. Not to mention, part of this book is actually each family member kind of wakes up one day with a flower bud on their body. So very much a spring embodiment. There's lots of growth and rebirth happening within this story. This follows the Montoya family, and they are used to very unusual things kind of happening to them. Pantry never runs out of food, and the matriarch of the family will never leave her home no matter what. Not for birthdays, not for weddings, not for baby showers, until one day each member of the family receives an invitation to the matriarch's funeral, even though she's still alive. It's very on brand for her. It's very dramatic and sweeping. So from there, many members of the Montoya family arrive at Arcadia Divina's home, the matriarch, in hopes of finally getting some of their questions answered that they have had their entire lives. But instead, Orquidea turns into a tree and blesses some members of this family with a magical gift that begins to kind of develop and bloom over the course of many years. In this story, we primarily follow three members of the Montoya family: Myanmar, Ray, and Ryanin. Each member was also touched by Arcadia Divina's magic at her funeral, as well as they're kind of like the next generation of this family. They're all young, they're all lost in their own ways, and they're kind of having to come to terms with themselves, as well as coming to terms with the family history and the story of Arcadia Divina. We follow this present day storyline as it's all wrapped in family magic and family history. It's beautiful. We see them travel and also have to stay at Arcadia Divina's home. So lush, not only in the writing, but as well as in the magical execution. Alongside the present day storyline, we also follow Arcadia Divina herself, and we see her childhood. We see her come up as a young woman and also have to make a variety of choices and kind of see her fate and how she got to the point of ultimately turning into a tree. This is a book that centers family and magic and heritage and history. It's beautifully done. It's absolutely gripping, and I don't know, it's all about rebirth. Like, to me, this is an ultimate spring read, just an ultimate read in general. One of my favorite recent reads for sure. It's delightful. Next up, I have a very whimsical option, a great middle grade choice if you're looking for something transportive and a little bit weird, and that is The Girl Who Circumnavigated Fairyland in a Ship of Her Own Making by Catherine M. Valente. It is no secret that I love middle grade. I particularly love weird middle grade books that's full of whimsy and adventure and kind of like a classic fairy tale vibe, and I feel like this series is definitely that and more. We follow our main character September, who longs for adventure. So when she's invited to Fairyland by the Green Wind and a leopard, she of course takes them up on this opportunity and is swept away to a new and magical place. But once September arrives in Fairyland, she quickly realizes that there's actually something very sinister at play, and there's a dark force and power which has been residing over this land and is kind of corrupting it with bureaucratic red tape and also controlling all of the residents that live there. So September decides to take it upon herself to fight against this evil Marquess and try to save Fairyland. And so begins book one to an incredible middle grade series that's full of magic and adventure and whimsy. Some of the most original scenes I truly have ever read, but it also does have a rather intense plot and really interesting twists, if I do say so myself. This book is just so clever. The audiobooks are amazing and just truly one of my favorite whimsical stories that will absolutely transport you. And the landscapes and the environment of Fairyland, again, is just so beautiful and dazzling. You will adore it. Next up, I feel like I always just have to plug starting this series at least every once in a while. I do feel like it is a very classic fantasy tale, so it could be very fun to pick up in the spring, and then it will also carry you through summer, fall, winter, the next year as well, depending on your reading speed, and that is the Farseer trilogy by Robin Hobb. I love Robin Hobb. I'm a Robin Hobb stan. I'll be talking about Robin Hobb for the rest of my life on this channel, but I love the Farseer trilogy. I will also say it has a special place in my heart. The Farseer trilogy is definitely much more slow moving. It definitely has a lot of angst. And this is primarily because we're following our primary character Fitz, who in the beginning of book 1 is a young boy who finds out he is the bastard son to the crown prince of the realm. He's basically moved to the central capital, and there he's raised within the castle itself, not really treated like a normal boy and definitely not treated like a royal. And he's constantly battling to find his place not only in the world but also within the Farseer line. Within this series, we watch Fitz grow up, come into his skill set. We see him be trained as an assassin. We see him get trained in magic. You see him fall in love and make friends. It's a very slow moving, complicated story, but it's very emotional. And the Farseer trilogy is also the first stepping stone into the Robin Hobb universe, which is just exceptional. If you love character-focused fantasy writing, if you love a more classical fantasy setting, things like quests and castle politics where kind of owing something to the king really means something, and that is definitely a very large plot point to this series. I love this series, and I do really feel like Robin Hobb has created something special with the character Fitz because we do spend so much time with him, decades of time with him throughout this series and later books as well, and it's just emotional, amazing. This is the time. If you haven't picked up Robin Hobb, pick up The Assassin's Apprentice. It's not very long. I gave the first book 3 stars, but it does really build on itself, so just give it some time. Give yourself some time. I promise you won't be disappointed. The next book I have to recommend is another beautiful option that will sweep you away and is a YA fantasy story, and that is Strange the Dreamer by Laini Taylor. I've actually read this book twice and just recently reread it again and fell in love with it probably even more than when I read it the first time. I really stand by that. I think this is one of the best YA fantasy series out there. It's just gripping, it's emotional, it's so wonderfully written, and I also just feel like the levels that Laini Taylor is able to explore both in the characterization but also in a fantasy world space is just really impressive, and I feel like is just very good YA fantasy. But this is a dual perspective story that primarily follows one of our main characters, Laszlo, and Laszlo is a librarian, but he is also a dreamer. He has spent so much of his life dreaming about his future, but mostly dreaming about a lost place called the City of Weep. This place was once a very powerful city, but one day just suddenly disappeared, not only off maps and history, but also out of the minds of everyone in the world, and the name itself was actually lost. But Laszlo remembers this day and has dedicated his life to try to investigate and understand this lost place. And his personal and professional dream actually comes true when an envoy arrives from this lost city and starts gathering experts in a variety of different fields of study, and Laszlo actually travels with them back to the city itself. And from there, he kind of becomes enmeshed within this city's past and history, and also is trying to solve their present problem. This series is emotional. There is another POV that you do encounter in this, and it's just so expertly balanced and done. I love the characters. I feel like it's scaled well. I also feel like the emotional depth and the ages of this book is also really handled very well, and I just loved everything about it. It was amazing, it was beautifully written, it was emotional. It's also a quick read and only a duology, which I feel like is also a nice thing to kind of have on your shelf because you don't have to commit to like a 18 book series like you would with Robin Hobb. Definitely one of my favorite YA fantasy series for sure. Speaking of a beautiful YA fantasy duology, I have another one for you, and that is Raybearer by Jordan Afueko. Another incredibly realized, beautifully written, and imaginative and unique YA fantasy duology with an incredible found family component at the heart of it, and truly just like one of the most unique literary experiences I've encountered within this genre in a long while. This is a story that also spans a rather large expanse of time, and I do feel like it combines elements of like folklore and storytelling that you might kind of encounter in middle grade, but is very intense and also has a lot of emotional emotional maturity and kind of growth and character arcs we would also want to encounter in the YA fantasy space. This duology follows our main character Terasai, and she was raised in a very remote area by a very reclusive and hard to grasp figure called the Mother. She loves the Mother, but she also was never really given any emotional warmth or care from this figure. She was also raised for the single purpose of trying out for the magical council for the crown prince, winning a seat on this council, gaining the prince's trust to ultimately then assassinate him. Terasai, of course, will do anything to try to please her mother, but once she eventually tries out for this council and makes it in, she quickly realizes that she actually loves all of these individuals, and so begins the internal war that Terasai must confront as she kind of balances the expectations of her blood family with her found family. I love this series so much. I think the storyline that we follow with Terasai is just incredible. There's so much magic and folklore baked within the story, but I just love the found family component. I also love the different types of love that Jordan Afueco includes within this book. Platonic love to romantic love. There's just so much there to explore. Also just the discussion of choosing the people around you that are going to lift you up, and you don't necessarily owe anyone your love if they're not able to support and care for you in the way that you need. It's just a beautiful story all around, a very well realized and completed YA fantasy duology that also has such incredible setting and lyrical writing that I think just makes it a perfect spring read. The next book is just always a favorite of mine. From the movie adaptation to the book itself, it's just beautiful. Just the landscapes and the experience of this book I just love so much and will always live in my heart. And that is Howls Moving Castle by Diana Wynne Jones. Listen, the movie Howls Moving Castle is just truly my favorite. And the visual experience of that movie I definitely have like imprinted within the book itself. If you've seen Howls Moving Castle, I mean, talk about a spring movie. I mean, the flowers, the fields, just the landscapes are just stunning and divine, and that sort of experience definitely, of course, exists within the source material itself, the book. But if you're not familiar, this is a story that follows our main character Sophie, and she's the eldest daughter of 3, and she's basically accepted her fate that she's never going to be able to seek adventure or leave home, and she just has to handle the family business. Unfortunately, she accidentally captures the eye and the hate of the Wicked Witch of the Waste, who casts an evil spell on Sophie, transforming her into an old lady. From there, Sophie has to leave home, and she basically seeks refuge and hopefully help from a mysterious magician known as Hal. She has to locate down his moving castle, hence the story of Howl's Moving Castle. It's romantic, it's delightful, it's full of adventure, incredible scenery imagery. I don't know what feels more spring than reading this book and watching the movie. It's amazing. So if you haven't already, I highly recommend checking this book out. The very last book I'm going to recommend for a spring read is The Ghost Bride by Yangshi Chu. I love this book. I think it's romantic and again just has that amazing transportive lyrical writing. This is a historical fantasy story set at sort of the turn of the century in Malaysia, and we follow our main character Lilan, who comes from a genteel but very bankrupt family, and she is very concerned about her future prospects as well as her future safety as a woman, as a lot of security is acquired through marriage. So when a very unusual proposal comes from a rich and powerful family, Lilan does consider it, and that is to marry their son who has recently passed away and become his ghost bride. She does decide to decline, but shortly after this she begins to realize that she is being haunted, and Lilan basically must go into an adventure into the Chinese afterlife to try to save herself and her family. This book is just absolutely so delightful. It's very intense and honestly rather dark and gripping, especially with the component of being haunted and just the overall vibe of the afterlife being so central within the book itself. But the adventure we follow Lilan go on and her desire to seize her own fate and destiny is just mesmerizing, and it's also just so cool. Just the Chinese afterlife setting is so well realized and interesting, and kind of seeing the interaction between the living and the dead and how things like offerings and currency provided to the dead help the dead move through the afterlife itself. This book is really intense. It has elements of romance. It also has a very fast moving plot, with lots of twists and turns and surprise moments. And honestly, I just found it really, really gripping. It's not very long at all, but it does have a beautiful setting, not only in life in Malaysia, but also in the Chinese afterlife as well. And I feel like all those components just make it a delightful read to pick up this spring or in the future, just anytime. This is one of my favorite books by Yang Shichu for sure. Alrighty guys, those are some must-read spring book recommendations. Let me know below some books you think are perfect for spring, as I would love to know, and I will see you soon with another video soon. Goodbye!